This podcast is recorded on the lands of the Ngunnawal people. We acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before we dive into today's episode, I do want to acknowledge that some of the topics discussed may be triggering or difficult for some people to hear. If you or someone you know and care about is affected by intimate partner violence or abuse, please consider reaching out for help. You are most definitely not alone. The Run Bitch Run podcast is dedicated to the women in Australia that are taken from us every year due to intimate partner and gender-based violence. The attitudes of men in this country towards women paints a very ugly picture. Fervent denial of gender inequality, victim blaming, and the instant dismissal of abuse claims when a woman steps forward all contribute to the culture of violence that we bear witness to every single day. This podcast aims to help women spot the red flags before it's too late. When we see the signs, we can break the cycle. Hello. Welcome to the first episode of Run Bitch Run. Run Bitch Run. That's how you can say it. That's how I choose to say it every time someone asks me, what's the name of your podcast? And I say, Run Bitch Run. And then they ask me again and I say very politely, oh, it's called Run Bitch Run. And they're like, oh, I thought I heard you correctly. You did. That's the title. I wanted to find something that is kind of quirky, a little bit out there, kind of in the vein of like Call Her Daddy-esque, sort of provocative. But also it's what I scream every time anybody is running from somebody in a horror film. So I feel like it was a great title because in Australia, we're all living in a fucking horror film, apparently. I wanted to start by giving a few really interesting statistics, and then I'm going to go into a little bit about me, a little bit about why I'm choosing to make this podcast, and I think I'll also go and tell you guys about the first of, I don't want to say many, but the first, most significant first abusive relationship that I was in. Which was when I was in high school. So I'm 28 now. So you would hope that I've learned something in the last, I don't know what, for 12 years, I think, 11, 12 years. You would hope that I've learned something from that time. So I figure it'll be fun to kind of go through and just tell the first, like I said, not of many, just the first abusive relationship that I was in, and what I have learned from that. Because I joke about it, but no, I have actually learned quite a lot in the past 10, 12 years. So, uh, actually, I'm going to start with a little intro on me instead of going into the statistics because they're a bit heavy. And I figure if I start with an intro to myself, maybe that's a bit less heavy. So, hello, my name is Audrey. I am 28 years old. I live in the beautiful city of Canberra in the Australian Capital Territory. But I am originally from Townsville, which is in North Queensland. And I assume if you're listening to this, you're probably Australian, so you know where both of those places are. But if you don't, one of them is on the coast, which is Townsville. That's on a nice little beach town. And then Canberra is it's the capital of Australia, but it sits between Sydney and Melbourne. So I love it here. I've been here for about 10 years. I kind of attribute moving to Canberra with helping me get out of kind of a few different like toxic mindsets, just meeting people here. Everyone's quite significantly, I mean, not everybody, obviously, but a lot of people that I've met in my travels in Canberra are quite politically left leaning, quite progressive. And I grew up around a lot of the other side of that spectrum. So a bit more of the, I don't say right wing, but I think conservative is a little more appropriate. So I would definitely attribute me moving to Canberra with becoming the lovely feminist that I am today, the intersectional feminist that I am today, which we will go into a bit later on as well. But essentially, I am 28. I live in Canberra. I have a beautiful partner who I'm marrying in December, which I'm very excited about. But I'm also polyamorous, which I think is a really no, well, it's not the most interesting thing about me, but I think it is an interesting thing about me and my partner, is that we are polyamorous and we have been polyamorous for a few years now, a couple of years now. We did start our relationship being monogamous, and I obviously have been in a number of monogamous relationships. And so I think in a future episode, I do want to touch on monogamy versus polyamory because I think there is a really interesting discussion to be had there. But I think I would save that for when I have a guest on the podcast, which episode 1, the one that you are listening to right now, is just a solo episode with myself, obviously. And I just wanted to kind of put something out there because it's really difficult. I know. For context, I put out a call to action on my social medias for the Run Bitch Run podcast, which I will leave links down below if you wanted to go follow the social media. For the podcast, feel free. And I basically put out a call to action to have like the ability for people to send me stories because that is, and I'll go into it as well in a second, but that is a big motivator for the podcast, is essentially having a spot and a place on the internet where just the average Australian woman can talk her shit. Because I do feel like even though, there are certain aspects to me that are quirky and a little weird, I am so average. I say that not as a ding to myself, but I just, I'm no better than any other person on the street. I am very average. I don't own a home, so I'm not in the elusive homeowners club. I live reasonably paycheck to paycheck. I work a full-time job. Like, I am the average Australian. And I think realizing that after trying to be something special my whole life and being told that you can be special and whatever, I feel like I'm really settled in the fact that I'm just an average bitch. Like, I am just an average bitch, and I'm okay with that because I I'm fine with that, honestly. And I feel like there needs to be more of a voice for the average bitch, which this is why I wanted to make the podcast because I don't know if anybody else went to the rallies that were held by What Were You Wearing? The beautiful, lovely organization that basically organized all the rallies across Australia last year to fight back somewhat against domestic violence against women. Um, it was one of the most moving, incredible things I've ever been to. I was very much at the front when Anthony Albanese took the stage and spoke about the crisis in a way that admittedly was a bit underwhelming, which made headlines at the time. And it was really, really eye-opening to me, just the amount of stories that you don't hear, the amount of stories that don't get told because maybe it's not a perfect victim narrative and maybe, you know, people are too afraid to come forward. And I think I think coming out of that, a bit of a sense of helplessness. And so I think what I really wanted to emphasize is that I'm making this podcast because I feel so helpless, because myself and so many other women I've spoken to in my life feel so helpless. We can't walk down the street at nighttime without feeling like we need to carry a weapon on us. We don't feel safe. I barely feel safe going for a walk down the fucking street in daytime, quite frankly, and I live in a relatively safe area. I think that it's very daunting to tell your story, but I really wanted to make that space on the internet and to give it a go because I've been told my whole life, you love the sound of your own voice, Audrey. You love the sound of your own voice. You love to have a yap. And I fucking do love to have a yap. But why is that such a bad thing? And I've let myself internalize that. So in part, I think this podcast, I'm making it for a few reasons. One, the biggest is because I feel helpless. The two, I want to help women identify maybe the smaller things. I think we focus on a lot of the big things in society. We're telling men don't hit women, but there's a lot of emotional abuse that goes on that isn't talked about because it's such a gray area in a lot of times. But when you look at the big picture, when a woman is fucking murdered, it's just, you see all these red flags that leading up to it, and people think, oh, if only we'd seen it back then. It's time to see them, because it's fucking time to see them. I'm ready to point them out, and I'm ready to have women and the average bitch just like me on the podcast to talk about how to point these things out and how to get out before you're in a place where you feel like you can't leave. I think that what I'm going to first also talk about is a few statistics. I mentioned them before, and they're very key, and they underpin, again, a lot of the reason why I'm doing this. So in 2022 to 2023, one woman was killed every 11 days. Comparatively, one man was killed every 91 days by an intimate partner. Compared to the global average of 21%, more Australian men, 30%, believe that gender inequality doesn't really exist. More Australian men, with 28%, believe that women often make up or exaggerate claims of abuse or rape, compared to men from the US, 17%, Canada, 13%, and the UK, which is 13% as well. Almost double, if you didn't understand that, almost double of Australian, comparatively with the men in Canada and the UK, double the amount of men in Australia, so 28% compared to 13% in those countries, believe that women often make up or exaggerate claims of abuse or rape. So just sit with that for a second, because that's definitely something to sit with. Nearly a third, 32% of young men believe that a lot of the time women who say they were raped had led the man on and then had regrets. So, yep. And again, coming back to my point earlier where I made about intersectional feminism, I also really want to highlight, and it's going to be a big part of this podcast as well, that First Nations women are disproportionately affected by this kind of violence. As per the Willis report from 2011, estimates suggest that around 90% of violence against First Nations women and most cases of sexual abuse of First Nations children are undisclosed. Not to mention, the rate of family violence hospitalizations for First Nations women is 33 times higher than for non-Indigenous women. I'm hopeful that I will get to have at least one, if not many, awesome Aboriginal and Indigenous First Nations Australian advocates from the local community that can speak to this as well and talk about red flags in their own communities. That is a hope that I have for this podcast as well. So if you're listening to this and you are interested, please, please, please send me an email because I'd really love to amplify your voices. So why gaslighting for episode number 1 of the Run Bitch Run podcast? I think that is because I genuinely feel that gaslighting underpins a lot of the stories we're going to be hearing about in a way that is sometimes kind of pushed to the wayside. And I don't think it should be. I think that we should be putting gaslighting to the forefront, and we should be reminding ourselves of the impact that this kind of emotional abuse has. Gaslighting. Where does that phrase even come from? Well, in 1938, British playwright Patrick Hamilton wrote a play called Gaslight, which was 2 words. This was before they were conjoined as we know it today. The play follows a husband, Jack, who very slowly begins to manipulate his wife, Bella, into believing she's losing her mind. He does stuff like moving objects around the house and then telling her that she was the one who misplaced them. But the real kicker is that he dims the gas-powered lights in their home, and when she notices, he insists nothing has changed. Over time, she starts questioning her own memory, her senses, and essentially her entire perception of reality. Fast forward to 1944, Hollywood releases a film adaptation starring Ingrid Bergman, which was a massive success, by the way, and the absolute legend that she was, won an Academy Award for Best Actress for her role in that movie. For decades, psychologists and therapists referenced the film when describing cases of emotional abuse. And by the 1960s, the term gaslighting, which of course the words now being conjoined, had become a recognized term in psychology. Fast forward again to the mid 2010s, and the Me Too movement being in full effect propelled the term once again into popular culture. And now the year is 2025, and admittedly, you do hear gaslighting kind of everywhere, which I do worry that when these kind of words getting into the wrong hands means the water might get muddied and people lose sight of the impact that this kind of emotional abuse has. So why do some people gaslight? Is it a conscious thing or more of an unconscious thing? Does it come naturally to some but not to others? From the article Gaslighting, What Is It and Why Do People Do It?, author Susan McQuillan writes, "It bears repeating that gaslighting is an unhealthy form of control arising from a need to dominate others. Certain mental health conditions, such as narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, lend themselves to gaslighting, as those illnesses give people a distorted view of themselves and others and a propensity toward manipulating others for their own needs by any means necessary, as well as never acknowledging their own culpability or faults and projecting that onto others." Gaslighting is not just lying, it's lying with intent, and the aim is to break down confidence in your own personal judgment. I think most of us at some point have told a white lie to comfort others or just to maintain harmony between friends, but gaslighting only serves to benefit the perpetrator by helping them gain control and/or power. This can be control of one person or a whole group of people. There's also often an element of avoiding accountability for their wrongdoings and a sense of wanting to win an argument. So if you're listening to this and you're worried that your partner is showing signs of being somebody who is a gaslighter, ask yourself, are any of these patterns present in your arguments with them? Do they often have to have the last word when you're arguing with them? Or even just in general? And are you usually the one that's in the wrong? As I mentioned before, I think that it would be really interesting to reflect back on my first relationship, which was also my first abusive relationship. Actually, it wasn't my first relationship, but it was definitely the first relationship I felt was more serious. I'd had little boyfriends and things, but not really with the depth that this relationship had. And I think that that's obviously largely because this is the person that took my virginity. So this is kind of this is staged around when I was 16, I think, up until I was about 18. So we were together, me and this person, it was a guy, and we were together for about a year and 9 months through high school, but he had actually dropped out of high school. So I was still in high school and he was not in high school. I don't really remember what he was doing when I was at school, but I don't think it was a lot, and I think it was probably drug dealing, or definitely was drug dealing, but who gives a fuck? Who gives a fuck now? I don't give a fuck. And the reason I don't give a fuck is because of all the abuse that I got put through in this fucking relationship. So just a bit of a timeline. We started dating. It wasn't a great start to the relationship because I had actually been dating his best friend, which I know poo-poo on me. Have not been a fan of that choice my whole life. But everyone around us thought that there was cheating involved. I maintain to this day there was not cheating involved. Regardless, the relationship started when my ex before this had moved away and I started seeing this person, and we just honestly started to fall in love, and there were a lot of moments at the beginning that I still hold very near and dear to my heart. Like I said, this is the person that took my virginity, or not took my virginity, the person that I had my first sexual experience with. He didn't take anything from me. There's nothing to be taken. That's not how virginity works. Anyway, conversation for another day. And it sort of started to become a bit more abusive in the second year. So The first year was fine, everything was Gucci. I graduated from high school, and then we were together for about another 9 months after I graduated from high school. So, I the big kind of red flags were he started to not sort of want to spend time with me, not want to talk to me. I don't remember a huge amount around this, but I just remember he started to pull back. And because I was, 16, 17, I didn't know how to deal with that. And I have daddy issues, which I'm not afraid to say, which I will probably get into another day. But I did start to seek out friendship and attention from another guy. And is this right? No. Was I sneaking going behind my partner at the time's back? No, not really. It was just somebody that I had developed a close friendship with, and we would talk all the time. And honestly, we would just play video games together all the time. My partner that I was with wasn't liking that I was seeking out that kind of emotional support in somebody else, especially not another guy. And so it just kind of started this cycle of abuse that I didn't really know how to navigate at all. I was starting to become victim to a lot of controlling behavior, including I remember one time I went to a girlfriend of mine's house that she had just moved into with her partner at the time. And I was so excited. She was showing me around. And then I get messages from my boyfriend asking me to send him photos of where I was because he didn't trust that I wasn't with this other guy. And to be clear, the only time I hung out with this other person, we only hung out one time, and I went to a party at his house. And nothing happened that night. So I understand from my partner at the time's perspective, I do understand that it definitely looked to him like there was some emotional abuse going on. But there wasn't ever an attempt to actually talk to me about it. It was always, no matter what I did, it was wrong. I basically had to cut off this person. I wasn't allowed to have guy friends. It just really started to spiral. It wasn't healthy. And then obviously started having to send him photos of where I was. Like I said, wasn't allowed to have guy friends, was barely allowed to have girlfriends, honestly. If I was talking about him, that was not good. What kind of really made it spiral out of control for me, or like the moment that I realized it was really spiraling out of control and I should have left when this happened, but again, I didn't know what to do. I went to so in Townsville, there is a yearly festival called the Palm Creek Folk Festival, and it's basically an excuse for teenagers to go and hang out, at their family's campsite, but actually go and get drunk and smoke cones in the bush, and that's pretty much, what it was for us back then. So, one time we went and my partner at the time got there a little bit after me, and so I'd come with, a neighbor of mine and my best friend, I think my best girlfriend at the time, if I remember correctly. And we got there a little early, but our friends had already gotten there, or some of them had already gotten there, and so they'd set up the campsite for us. So we got there, we unpacked. Me and my neighbor went separate ways, and then I decided, oh, let me go and find some friends of mine that I went to, that I worked with at McDonald's. Shout out McDonald's at the Lakes, that I worked with there. I went to go and hang out with them. They were smoking cones, and I was no stranger to smoking cones at that point. So I went and together we smoked a cone. And I was gone for probably like maybe an hour or two from the campsite. But my boyfriend had turned up in the meantime, and naturally that wasn't okay. And what eventuated was I came back to the campsite, and he pulled me into the tent that we were staying at, and he just kept screaming at me about how he had been watching me text them, and he knew that I was texting them, and he doesn't understand why I was cheating on him, and I needed to show him my phone. And then eventually he actually grabbed my arm, and he tried to force me to show him my phone, and I actually had to say, hey, his name, you're hurting me. And nobody came into my tent, nobody checked if I was okay, and I thankfully eventually got him out of my tent, but it was really fucking traumatizing, the fact that he got, for a moment, violent with me, in that he wouldn't let me go, and he was squeezing me hard enough to hurt me, and I hadn't been texting the guy that I worked with, I'd only gone over there to have a smoke and then came back to the tent and hung out with everyone else. And it just went so shit. And then I remember waking up that night, it was about 3 or 4 a.m., and he couldn't find me. I think he was so drunk that he couldn't find me. I couldn't find where I was, and he kind of forgot that I had just been in the tent bawling my eyes out for hours. And he proceeded to scream to everyone about how much of a slut I was, and just screaming this out to the whole festival at 3 a.m., to all the surrounding campsites was really fucking traumatizing. And unfortunately, everyone around me didn't really know what to say, didn't know really what to speak up and say or anything. And so I just kind of had to deal with it. And I remember thinking at the time that even us breaking up was possibly the worst thing that could have ever happened to me. And so I decided to stay because it was easier than leaving. And the reason I ended up leaving in the end was because he had moved into a house with some housemates. And this was towards obviously the year and 9 months. So I was really starting to get done with it. And I wasn't seeing any way to fix it. I was seeing that he was starting to spiral and it was becoming really unhealthy for both of us. It had been really unhealthy for both of us for a really long time. Um, and so I went to his house to chat to him about the fact that I was unwell and that I had gotten a UTI. And that was because I didn't know that because I had just started having sex with this person. It was the first fucking person I ever had sex with. I didn't know that I had to pee before, well, ideally before and definitely after sex as a person with a vagina. So didn't know that and got a UTI, went to him and told him, hey, I've got a UTI. And he just looks at me and says, I don't know, Audrey, that's awfully suspicious. And I just remember looking at him being like, hold on. Obviously my prefrontal lobe, or the fuck, my prefrontal cortex hadn't like fully generated, but I can imagine it was, a come to Jesus moment, if you know what I mean. And I just looked at him and I'm like, you pathetic fuck. This is clearly nothing to do with you. This is my body having a reaction to what I'm telling you it's having a reaction to. And you're turning around and telling me that I'm cheating on you. And that's why. It's not an STI. You're just uneducated. And I obviously didn't say that. What I did do was I got up and I walked the fuck out of there. He tried to grab me again. Love that for him. No, thank you. And I walked the fuck out. And as soon as I could, I got in my little 2007 Mitsubishi Lancer, and as soon as I drove away, like far away enough, he didn't have a license, so I knew he wasn't going to come after me. What was he going to do? Run after me? Obviously not. And I drove far enough up the road that I was able to pull over, and I texted him and I said, yep, that's it. We're done. Bye-bye. Well, I was probably much nicer about it back then. What can I say? But as we do now, fuck politeness. Should have just said, fuck you, goodbye. But I didn't. And what I did do was I probably politely said, I'm sorry, can't do this anymore. And then I blocked him, deleted him, because I knew, even my very little young 17-year-old brain, I knew that if I let him manipulate the situation, we would never stop. It would go in a cycle of abuse forever, ever and ever and ever. I had seen it modeled to me, unfortunately, through men that my mum had dated, which I'm definitely sure I'll go into another time, my upbringing, with kind of how relationships had been modeled to me growing up. But I could just tell, that was my come to Jesus moment. I could see it. I could see 20 years in front of me. The second he said to me, oh, that's a bit suspicious, I could see it. I could see my life unfolding in front of me, and either I would get knocked up and I would be tied to him forever, or I would get, God forbid, get married to him, then be tied to him forever. Something would happen where I'd be tied to this man forever and I would never get out of the cycle of abuse. And I had to end it right then, right there, right here, right now. And the best thing is that I actually genuinely continued to feel bad for him. And I really wanted to help him. A few years after high school, I took pity on him. I'll be honest. I took pity on him. and I wanted to catch up. I wanted to see how he was going. And this motherfucker has the nerve to turn around and say to me, "Oh, yeah, we can hang out, but no funny business, though." No funny business? Are you fucking kidding? As if your cock is descended from the heavens itself. I'm so sorry. Not made of gold, darling. Not made of gold. Not that good either. It's fine. Like, I just don't understand why these men would. Why would I touch you with a 10-foot pole after I left you? I've also had a number of women message me I would say the 1 to 5 years after leaving high school, messaging me, telling me about the shit that he put them through. And funnily enough, he kept getting older, but the women he dated didn't. Isn't that just crazy? I haven't heard from him in a while, and I think I'm finally at the point where I don't need to hear from him ever again. But I do feel somewhat bad that his life ended up the way it has. I haven't heard great things about how his life's going, and he is a product of his upbringing. I don't think he had very good relationships modeled for him either. But there are many men, many, many men in this life that don't have good relationships modeled for them growing up. Neither have I. But there is a big difference between the men that will take the time to educate themselves, to make themselves a better person so that they do not abuse their partner. I personally have done the work. I continue to do the work. Do I think that he's done the work? Probably not. And that's okay. But if you're dating people and you're putting that onto other people, it's not okay. And you should be trying to be better. Okay, so enough yap from me. I think that that's a pretty good summary of the first abusive relationship that I was in personally. If you want to tell me about the first abusive relationship that you were in, or if you had any other great stories that you wanted to tell, not great in, not great in that it happened to you, but great in that you have always wanted to tell someone your shit and you can now have a space to talk your shit, which I think is a little bit great. So please send me an email to rbrthepodcast@gmail.com, or there is also a link in the description of this episode for where you can fill out the form. There's a little form, and you can either send me an audio or text recording or whatever to my email, or you can write up your submission to through my form. So I also am going to include a survey in the description to this episode as well. And I would love if you had any kind of feedback or any advice or any criticism to please send me your response in that survey as well, because I'd love to hear it. Okay, so before I sign off today, I do want to include our very first submitted story. So this is from a very fucking awesome Aussie queen who sent me through a few different stories via email, and they're not audio, so I'm going to read it out myself. But this is an awesome first story, honestly. I thought that this was a really great summary of kind of the red flags that you see when you're a bit younger, that you can reflect on when you're a bit older and think, what the fuck was I doing? My ex was a walking red flag. I ignored the fact that his ex had an AVO out against him because he told me some bullshit about how they had it out for each other. I ignored the fact that he didn't have a car and used me for a lift everywhere. I ignored the fact that he couldn't hold a job and used me as his personal bank. His only friends were much younger than he was. I was 21 and he was 30 turning 31 when we first started dating. I forgave him for cheating on me the first time because he was high and didn't know what he was doing, apparently. He changed on me with the ex that had the AVO too. Classy. Stupid of me, I know. But I was young and in love, I guess. At the time, I thought I was punching. What really turned it over for me one night was I was at his place and his roommate had long since moved out. I found a bobby pin, but one of the blonde colored ones. I was not blonde at the time, I was very much a brunette. And he claims that this bobby pin was his old roommate's girlfriend's. So, as if it was, I would have seen it prior, that was it. And I left that evening, telling him that I was going home, and as soon as I could, I pulled over and I blocked him on everything, changed my bank cards, and logged him out of everything that I could. He reached out through his sister and his auntie a few times, but I told them that I was done. So bloody done. About a year later, I was invited to a group chat on Instagram with the several women he dated after me. All reached out to relay their stories and trauma dump. I don't know how they found me, but they did. He was telling these women that I was abusive towards him, and that's the reason why he was so damaged and cheated on all of them. He told them that I was financially abusive too, which I was the only one working through the relationship, and I was on shit wages because I was so young. These women all believed him to the point where one of them called us all liars and blocked us because she was so in love with him still. He had cheated on about 5 other women with each other after I left him. Told them all he had a kid, which he didn't. Just a walking red flag, honestly. And now I'm happily married to a man who treats me like a bloody fucking queen. And I'm so grateful every single day for him. But some men are gross and fucking dumb. Thanks. And that's the end of the episode. So I wanted to say thank you so much for listening. This was the first episode of the Run Bitch Run podcast, which is independently produced by myself and voiced and written by me. But it's also credit to every woman in Australia that's ever dealt with the topics of abuse that we discuss on the podcast, and anyone that really has always wanted to have a voice that hasn't had a voice. Your support is so greatly appreciated. And if you did have time to leave a nice review on whatever streaming service you're using, that would also be very, very appreciated, but no pressure at all. I also wanted to re-mention that for anyone that was having a hard time listening to anything that we talked about or any of the stories, there are links and resources available in the description of the episode. And as always, I do encourage you to seek out help if you need it. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in episode 2. Thank you.